Now let's start with the actions. Here I'll add a login action and also already a sign up action. And we have to start with sign up actually, of course, because we first need to create a user before we can log in. Here we get this context object and a payload. And now here I want to send a HTTP request to this Firebase auth REST API to sign up with email and password. So to this URL. So let's grab this URL here and use the fetch function to send a request to that URL. And actually this URL wants an API key, which is unique per Firebase application. So in your Firebase project, you can click on this gear icon, project settings, and then grab this web API key. Now you can't use mine because this project will already be disabled when you're viewing this, but grab your key in your project. And once you get that, enter it here instead of this square bracket API key square bracket thing. This is required for the request to succeed later. Now this sends a request to sign a new user up. However, just like this, it would send a GET request, and if we have a look at the docs, we see instead it should be a POST request. We also see which data needs to be added to the request, email and password, and then this return secure token key, which should always be true. Okay, so let's add this second argument, this configuration object for the request, set the method to POST, and also set the body to a JSON stringified object, which has an email field, which we should get from our payload, a password field, which I also expect to get on the payload, and this return secure token field, which should always be true. And this should send a request that creates a new user. Now, as always, fetch returns a promise, and therefore we can either use then and define the code we want to execute once this is done in the function we pass to then, or we use this alternative way of using async await, which I'm doing here, so that we can await the response, and then the next line only executes once that response is there. And here I get that response data by awaiting response.json. And then we can also check if the response is maybe not okay, in which case I want to construct an error, a new error, where I look into my response data and see if I got a message there. And otherwise, I will set this to failed to authenticate. And then I throw this error. And if we make it past this if check, we should have a valid response and authentication should have succeeded. Actually, I will also console log response data here so that we see what's in a response if it's not okay. So which kind of data we get back from Firebase then. So if we make it past this if check, we succeeded. And now we want to see what's in the response data in the success case. Actually, we don't even need to guess because we see it here in the response payload documentation. We will get back an ID token, which is this token I mentioned on the slide. We get back an email, a refresh token, which we don't need here, information on when that token expires. For security reasons, it doesn't live forever. You could refresh it with the refresh token, but that's advanced and we're not going to cover it here. And you get back local ID, which is the user ID of the newly created user. And there are at least 3 interesting pieces of information here. The token, which we will need later to send requests to restricted resources. The expires in information, so that we know how long that token is valid. And the user ID. So in the mutation, which we should create here, I want to store all that data in Vuex. I'll name the mutation setUser because it's not tied to signing up or logging in. Here we get that data back for signing up, but if we check for signing in, so for logging in, we see it's pretty much the same information. So therefore, I'll have the same mutation. And here I get my state and also a payload. And I want to set state token equal to payload dot token, set state user ID equal to payload dot user ID, and set state token expiration equal to payload token expiration. So this assumes that we get a payload that has these three fields when this mutation is committed. Now we want to commit set user here in our action. There with context commit, we want to commit set user, and now we need to pass an appropriate payload object, which has token, user ID, and token expiration fields. So back in our action, here in this object, I'll set token equal to response data dot ID token, because it's the ID token field on the response that holds that token. And it's a local ID for the user ID, so therefore I'll set the user ID field on the payload we pass to the mutation to response data dot local ID. Now regarding the token expiration, for the moment I'll just set this to response data dot expires in, but we'll change this later. We will only need this later, so for the moment it doesn't matter too much. Now we set these three fields in this mutation, and therefore in the initial state I also want to set them. Initially, let's say user ID is null, token is null, and token expiration also is null. Now with that we prepared the action and mutation. Now we can go back to the user auth page and dispatch this action when this form is submitted and we have valid input here. So then I want to check if this mode is equal to login, in which case the login action should be dispatched, which we don't support yet. But else we have the sign up mode. I want to dispatch this store with dispatch sign up. Since the module isn't namespaced, we don't need to add any namespace here. This will dispatch the sign up action, and of course we need to pass some payload to this action, because on this action we expect to get the email and password on the payload. So therefore here we should set email equal to this email, to the entered email in this component, and password to this password. Okay, if we now save that and we go back, if we go to sign up instead and we try to submit this in an empty way, we get our error. Also if we are just missing the password. But if the data here is valid and we try this, we don't get any visual feedback at the moment, but we get this response, which looks pretty good. It's an object with all that data I described, with the local ID and so on. And on Firebase, if we refresh this users page under authentication, we should also see that user here. Now if I try creating the same user again, we'll see that we get an error. And that's the response data we got back from Firebase in an error case, where we have a nested error object with a message of email exists. And we can utilize this in our action for better error handling thereafter, but that's actually the next step, because I also want to show a loading spinner whilst we are submitting, for example. But the main takeaway is that it generally works. So now let's work on the feedback we give the user before we then take the next steps and also make login work and then use that token.